Thank you, everyone, and like Caroline, I'll just take a seat here, just because we're both from Canada, and I guess that's what we do. So I will talk about network scholars, and when I refer to scholars, I refer to academics, researchers, and I'll talk about them in the organizational structure that Caroline described, which is networks. So think of networks as a particular organizational structure. Most of my talk focuses on the online structures, unlike Caroline, who was talking about just general social networks. Think of scholars, think of this as a particular application of ecologies as opposed, and of scholars as learners, even though we think of faculty members as the ones that are up here teaching other people. You can imagine that individual researchers or individual scholars also go online to learn about particular things, right? Whether that is to play the piano or to learn a new research method, they're also learners. So my research has focused recently on trying to understand these people, and that's what I'll talk about today. Thanks for the invitation to be here. It's my third time in Barcelona, and every time it's fantastic. I got off the plane, it felt very comfortable and very nice, and everyone's very welcoming, so it's fantastic to be back. So I live in British Columbia, and in particular, in Victoria, which is this large island right off the coast of Vancouver right there, and I can wave to Caroline from across the water. But basically, this is what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about what is network scholarship, how do we define it, what do network scholars do online, why are they there, and what are some of the challenges they face. So as we're talking about networks and ecologies and so on, I think we also need to inquire about the whys of these organizational structures and about the issues that might exist in these different organizational structures. And I think some of the work that we've done translates to other structures. So when I'll be talking about challenges, I think some of those might apply to ecologies. All these draws from this book that's just coming out, and I got this yesterday, so I thought I would put it here. But anyway, basically this is a summary of this book, so you don't need to buy it because I'm going to summarize it today. What is network scholarship? What does it entail? When I ask this question to people, some people think about the network part, other people think about the scholarship part. What does it look like when you put those two things together? Our definition thinks or concerns itself with the use of social technologies and participatory media in order to share, reflect, think about, critique, and further scholarship. And by scholarship, we mean both teaching and research activities. So both of those are included in there. We take an encompassing perspective on scholarship. But depending on the researchers you might read, some people might focus on research and so on. We take a non-deterministic perspective, which basically means that we don't start with the belief that technology is going to change practice, and we believe that technology will impact the way that people do research, but research will also impact the way that people use technologies. And you can think of that, for example, in terms of blogging. You can think of an individual thinking that blogs are now available and they're this easy to use technology, so I'm going to start blogging about my research. But you can think about it in the other way. You can think about researchers always having this desire to share their work. Then over time, this new technology comes about that makes it easy, so they use the technology, right? So the technology might not necessarily have led to any changes, but the desire to share might have always been there, and now that it's available, people start using it. So that's I guess, the stage that we start our research from. In the literature, there's various other descriptors that talk about this area. People might refer to digital scholarship or social scholarship or open scholarship, and those different definitions emphasize various things, right? Some people might focus on the idea of broadening access and reducing barriers. They might focus on sharing and so on. We believe that network scholarship encompasses all of these things. This is how you would visualize a network. Again, Caroline talked about this, but I'm not going to spend too much time on it. This is a LinkedIn visualization of, or there's a visualization of my LinkedIn network, and you can see that I'm connected with different groupings of people, right? The orange group might be the people that I went to school with. The blue group might be people from Barcelona, for example, right? So there are different groups situated in different ways. Both in the literature and in the general academy, we see an increasing desire for people to do network scholarship, to engage with open, to engage with digital practices in teaching, learning, and research. And we often ask why. Why is there this interest? Has something happened and people want to change their behaviors, or was this desire always there and people now want to engage with it? But essentially, these are the rationalizations that are provided in the literature. New forms of scholarship are expected to change the ways that we do things. They're expected to change the ways that knowledge is shared and created. There's a hope that new forms of scholarship are going to reduce costs, that they're going to increase the impact and reach of scholarship. For example, you can imagine someone being on Twitter and having 10,000 followers. If he or she tweets about a research paper, that many people might have access to it and so on. I'm not saying that that's happening, I'm saying that's just a possibility. So we'll go into what is happening in a little bit. But from a research perspective, I think it's interesting to try to understand this landscape. What is it happening and why is it happening? We don't really know how academics experience network scholarship. We have a poor understanding of that. Calls to adopt new forms of scholarship are usually driven by advocacy. So someone, usually an administrator comes and says, we should adopt social media because they will make our scholarship reach more people, or our academics will get more citations if they go online and so on. So we hear a lot of those claims, but we don't necessarily have much evidence to support that. So that's what our work tries to do. We're trying to understand what is actually happening, as opposed to what hope do we have for these tools. And we see that a lot in the digital education literature. There's a lot of claims about potential impact, that over time, as researchers engage with those claims, they discover that we always have hopes for the new technology transforming the way that we do things, but we don't necessarily see that impact on the ground. These are some of the technologies that academics use. I think you're probably familiar with a number of these, like Twitter and YouTube and Facebook and so on, and some academic-focused ones like academia.edu. What I think is important here is to understand that some of these are developed specifically for academics to share their work, like Mendeley and so on. But other ones are repurposed, right? So Twitter was never used for researchers to share their research with one another, right? And Facebook was not developed for professors to develop groups for their students to exchange information and so on. But for some reasons, they've been used in those contexts. And I think the question that arises is, well, what are the affordances of these tools that enabled them to be used in this way? But also, what are the philosophical assumptions of these tools that we are embedding in our classrooms when we start using them? For example, when Facebook says share and share everything and share now, is that part of our valued pedagogy, or is that value that Facebook is imposing on us are going to clash with the ways that we want to do education? We did an early paper in 2013 where we examined 45 academics. We basically gathered their latest 100 tweets, and then we categorized them to see under what categories these tweets fall under, right? It's a basic thematic analysis of the information that was shared. And these are some of the things that we found. If you take an academic from this sample and you look at his or her tweets, you will see announcements to publications, announcements to participation in a conference. You will see them posting draft papers. Like Norman's book, when he mentioned that he posted his book online, you will see those kinds of things. You will see them share syllabi and resources. They might live stream or live blog a conference. You will see them discuss collaborative authoring. So often this happens in the context of teams where they are working on a product that is usually made public so that others can contribute if they want to or not. You'll see debates. So usually debates center around new technologies. New technology comes along and someone says, oh, drones are going to be really helpful in education. So people engage in commentaries. There's lots of interesting debates around connectivism that happen online often. We saw that here. We've seen a few examples of academics sharing their promotion and tenure materials online, which I thought is a really interesting phenomenon because the application for promotion and tenure is usually a closed process, right? You submit, or at least in the North American context, these materials are compiled, they're given to a department that then evaluates them, and then they go to a dean and to the president and so on. But in these cases, these individuals that were applying for promotion made those materials available, and I thought it was a great example because at the different institution that I was, you couldn't even see colleagues' materials unless you specifically asked them and they specifically gave you permission to see them. So I thought making them public in this way was an interesting approach. Crowdsourcing is the process of asking people for input and feedback on particular things. Again, like the book example, we see it in other cases as well where one well-known case is a mathematician from the UK who was trying to solve a mathematical problem and posted about it in his blog and asked for colleagues for input and work with those colleagues to solve and publish the solution to this problem. When I talk about some of these activities, I often get the question, well, okay, this is interesting, but how many people do this? Are these just the early adopters? Are they the people who really embrace new technologies? And we had this conversation the other day, again, within the context of learning ecologies, right? You have these tools available. Some people might use them to learn various things outside of the classroom context, but how widespread is this practice? So this is a bit unclear with regards to network scholarship, but surveys in the US show that adoption is increasing over time and that there's more personal than professional use of network technologies for scholarship. Some surveys put this number at 50 to 70% adoption depending on the tool. Facebook 70%, Twitter 50%. Others put it between 15 and 40. So depending on which people you ask and where, you get different numbers. So I think the questions of why people do some of these things are really interesting. And it's a question that is worthwhile to explore in the context of learning technologies overall. So when we asked this question with our sample, And by sample, I mean network scholars, these are some of the answers that we get. People have blogs, for example, to explore scholarly ideas. They might post drafts of their work to get feedback. They might not be sure about those ideas, so they're writing in order to reflect. They want to share knowledge. They want to engage in debates and critique. They might provide advice to students. So a number of the professors that we interviewed are on Twitter, and they described how they really appreciate receiving questions from students who are not necessarily at their own institution about the field or about a particular paper that they wrote, and they value that interaction. So that's one of the reasons that brings them back. Connecting with other researchers, again, connecting to what Caroline was saying, when I'm on Twitter, I connect with a large number of people that I don't necessarily know, right? So you would say that we have weak ties, and in those weak ties, being present on Twitter is much easier to allow us to reach out to one another and have those conversations. They can reach multiple audiences, and this is one of the claims that's pervasive in the literature. By being on social media, academics can reach the audiences that do not necessarily read their papers. So, for example, journalists or practitioners, right? One of the criticisms against traditional education scholarship is that it's written for other people, for other academics. So I write a paper for Caroline and for Albert, maybe Rose would read it, so like 2 or 3 people read it, but it doesn't reach the teachers or the online educators that my paper is talking about. So the idea is that if you're on social media and teachers and educators are on social media, then perhaps my research and the implications of that might reach them, and it might actually have an impact beyond the academy. What we did find out is that adoption of these tools is goal-oriented and often tactical, though. So when academics embrace them, they have specific uses for them that they're seeking, right? So I didn't go online to do all of these things. I might have gone online to do, 1 or 2 of these. I might have connected with other academics and had debates, but I didn't go on Twitter to have debates, right? I went to share my paper and so on. So that's what we're increasingly finding. We're also seeing that universities are encouraging academics to go online to increase their impact, increase their citations, and so on, especially in North American and British context where this is driving a lot of the higher education narrative, showing impact, increasing citations. But what we see is that when we talk with academics, they say, I'm going online to find a community, essentially to find other academics where I can commiserate in the problems that I'm having in my day-to-day, research life, right? I'm going because in my own home institution, there's 2 other people in my department, and they don't do the same research as I do. They might have different perspectives on these topics. So it's much easier for me to find community in these spaces. So there's that conflict there between what the institution believes that people should do when they're online and what they actually do. And I think challenges are perhaps the most interesting part of this. These challenges might arise because the institution wants different things, and the reasons that scholars go online are different. But we've recently seen a number of high-profile cases where academics have gotten into trouble because of the things that they do online, or because the university perceived that the things that they were doing were not particularly what they wanted them to be doing. Lots of this is situated in the US, but I imagine it's present in other countries as well. For example, in conversations that I've had with colleagues, we've often had discussions around how much of your personal life should you share and not share, right? And that's obviously limited by culture. And in a survey of Canadian institutions in the last 2 years, academics have looked at the social media policies of the institution to try and see, well, what do they encourage and what do they not encourage? And what they observed is that those policies are essentially there to surveil and police academics, and they're there to make sure that if anything goes awry, there is a policy to essentially take care of the problem. A lot of people are concerned about the time that this might take. And we believe that these challenges and a lot of others that have not identified yet occur because of context collapse in these spaces. Context collapse refers to the notion that when you're online, multiple contexts come together and create a situation that we're not necessarily familiar with. So for example, if I ask you, who are you connected with on Facebook? A lot of you will say, friends, colleagues, maybe friends from high school, right? New academics and so on, maybe students, who knows. So you have all these different groups, right? And what one of the theories that we've developed around this concept says is that with different groups, you can have different conversations. So the conversation that I have with my wife is different than the conversation that I will have with my student, and it's different from the conversation that I will have with, Albert. But when all of these people are in one circle, and my status updates goes to all of them, what is acceptable for me to have a conversation with all of them becomes much smaller and smaller, right? So I will talk about, I don't know, how wonderful lunch was, right? I will talk about, I will show pictures of Barcelona, right? Great things that are acceptable to all these groups of people. So the number of things that I can share becomes increasingly smaller. And once I start sharing things that are only appropriate with one group, then I might quickly get in trouble, right? If I start talking about all the negative policies that my institution has, and my institution is following me, that might quickly, get me a visit from the marketing office that will say, well, you should not talk about this thing online. So I wanted to spend just a couple of minutes talking about some of our research work. A lot of our work has been qualitative, and the work that I'm going to just talk about is currently under review. So we've been trying to see how we can make sense of large-scale social media data, and we've identified different groups of people and different networks that we would like to study. And because I'm interested in education, we are mostly looking at education academics, so education professors. And one of the interesting questions that's in the literature, and I think in conversations around as well, is whether social media metrics can be used as a way to evaluate a scholar's reach or impact. So can I use, the number of downloads that the presentation received online in order to make an argument that I am having an impact on the field? The traditional metrics are, citations, impact factors, things like that. How good the journal is that you published in, and so on. So can I use my paper downloads from academia to say, well, this is also a metric? So we've tried to see if we can understand that by using social media data. There's other questions here as well, but I think this is an interesting one. So we found 470 education academics. We gathered a bunch of data about them. And then we said, well, what determines the number of followers that they have if we assume that the number of followers may be used somewhere as a measure of impact, right? You say, well, Albert has 50,000 followers on Twitter. He must have a great reach, and so on. So we've run our, ANOVAs and basically found that the number of followers is determined by how many years one is online on Twitter, is determined by the number of their tweets, whether they signal themselves as being professors versus students, and and with the number of followers that they follow. So if you, basically it says that if you want more followers, you should stay on Twitter for a long time. You should tweet, you should follow more users, and you should say, I'm a professor on your bio, right? So the implication of this is that follower counts are not necessarily a measure of impact or reach. They might be a measure of something else. This is our latest study that I was up yesterday night working on. But we talk about academics, but at the same time, I think some of these questions are interesting for the institution as well. So we try to see how institutions are using social media, and especially Twitter. We like to focus on Twitter because it's easy to collect data from Twitter, even though that is problematic by itself because other networks, we might see different behaviors in other networks, right? So you should not assume that what we see on Twitter, we can also see on Facebook. But as far as Twitter is concerned, if you take a look at the Twitter posts of Canadian institutions and try to make sense of what are they posting and what are they saying about their students and their faculty, you'll see that everyone's happy, the campus is beautiful, professors congratulate their students and their successes, and it never rains in Vancouver, apparently. There's a particular institution that likes to post videos. It's in Vancouver. So if you don't get the joke, Vancouver is always raining. There's actually a website that's called Is It Raining Today at UBC, and it's always raining. But in these videos, it's always sunny, and you never see rain. So that characterizes not just this area or this institution, it characterizes pretty much everything, all the other institutions that we've studied. So basically the argument is that Twitter in this space, it's a tool that's been used to manage the institutional brand and develop this identity that the institution wants to portray outside, right? So I think it's a good example to end with, to say that even though some technologies might be used well in some contexts, in other contexts, even within the same institution, they might be used quite differently. So when we are making arguments about students using Twitter or asking faculty to use Twitter, we should consider how the context might change the use of the tool, and we should consider how the tool itself might impact that practice. All right, so implications, I think I've covered these already, but that's where I'm going to end. I'm not sure, we have about 5 minutes, okay. I think I'll just leave you with this question that I have at the bottom. This question basically asks, how can universities support and encourage network participation without fear? I think the implicit assumption there is that, as we saw from the study that I just talked about, institutions who are on Twitter like to manage that brand, but in a number of cases that we saw this past year in particular, academics have gotten themselves in trouble because of the things that they've said online. And that conversation is really complicated because it deals with academic freedom, it deals with what is civil and what's uncivil and who gets to define that. And I think there's certain values here that might be worthwhile for the institution, but in this complex socio-political and economic place that institutions find themselves, it's difficult to make arguments about allowing academics full reign to do whatever it is that they want to do on social media. So my recommendation here would be for institutions, academics to come together to craft social media policies that are not only supportive, but that define what may be inappropriate prior to something being defined as inappropriate. So I'll end there, and you can grab any of this research from my website and from that link right there, and I'll post this presentation on SlideShare. But I think that in reflecting on the concept of learning ecologies and reflecting on academics who are online, who engage in various practices, who they themselves are learners, some of the interesting questions that I see are the idea of technologies shaping practice, but also being shaped by practice. It's the idea of personal and professional contexts collapsing. So when we're trying to make sense of how would people learn when they decide to learn, by themselves about a particular topic, we should be looking at how they're using the different technologies and how those technologies are configured in their both academic and personal life. And that would be something that I'd be interested in looking at the future. So thank you for your time, and we can have questions or questions later. Okay, great.